We have such a special guest on Ask Gardenstead today. With us is Darryl Cheng, who is the author of The New Plant Parent.
Yeah, that's right.
I am absolutely thrilled to be chatting with you about your book because your book is absolutely my favorite plant book that
thank
I've
you so much.
ever read. It is so thorough and well-researched, and one really neat thing about it is how you've been able to capture the before and after. So you are able to speak to something that you have seen the whole cycle of. So I have many plant books. I've been kind of collecting them. I get 1970s houseplant books from secondhand stores.
Yeah.
And this one runs deeper into the how exactly a plant works. So your mentality, you say there needs to be a shift in the way that we think about plants. And so tell me a little bit about how you have gotten to writing this book and where you got started.
Sure. So when a few years ago, when I was still living at home, my mom said to me, "Hey, let's decorate our place with some houseplants," because, as you said, it was trending, right? And so she just wanted to have some nice decor. But then, I did the usual thing. I go to a plant shop and I look at what looks pretty nice, and then I look at the tag and hopefully I can, follow these instructions, right? I put the plants at home, and then you do your research online, and I kind of got the sense that underlying all the advice that is typically, you've heard the typical type of plant advice, like it reads like here's a piece of decor and here's how you maintain it, right? And I felt that lacked a little bit of depth and didn't really speak to the way that I was fascinated by the plants. Like I was fascinated when I saw a new leaf popping out for the first time, right? Or just the way that the plant grows is something that I felt wasn't really captured in most plant care advice, right? So that's when I started my Tumblr account. This was, quite a while ago now, but it was just an easy way to write about my plants and take pictures of their progress, right? I treated them like kids. You see them grow up, right? And this eventually led to Instagram. When Instagram allowed 15-second video clips, that's when I posted time-lapse videos. And that kind of stuff really exploded. You could say it went viral. And that's kind of how I think I got the attention of an agent, like an author agent. And she looked at my writings, my captions, and said, I think you could write a good book about houseplants. And I said, oh, sure, I'd love to.
And you had that in your mind already when you were going through your Tumblr and your Instagram in the early days. Your brain was already going to this could be a book as well. So you were ready for your agent when it happened.
Yeah.
Because what you had said in your book is that, all of these instructions were just kind of blanket statements like tips and tricks, water every 7 days, etc. And you deconstructed that, really.
It's not that all that advice is wrong necessarily. All the instructions work in some contexts, and sometimes they won't work, right? But whether they work or not is also based on what your expectation is of the plant, right? And that's the expectations part is what I really wanted to draw out as well, is to say, how exactly is this plant going to grow, right? Is it going to look perfect forever as long as I follow these instructions? And that seems to be the implication when you read instructions, right? But what I was trying to do with my book is say, no. Here's what is going to happen to the plant because it's a living thing and it's going to grow, it's going to decay, it may even die, right? And I wanted to capture all of that so that we weren't just
disappointed.
We weren't just serving dessert only, right? We want to have the whole gamut of food, right?
Right. So one of your quotes is you say, an experienced plant parent is not the one who never loses a leaf. It's the one who knows how much leaf loss is normal. So that's very powerful. And I see it a lot with many houseplant owners is that a leaf will start to turn yellow or turn brown, and it is kind of a freak out moment.
Right. It is very disconcerting to see that happen, right? But if you kind of sit back and evaluate, okay, how am I looking at this plant? Am I looking at, I expected this to look perfect forever because I'm following these instructions. So the moment that leaf falls, I'm gonna think that something's wrong. And I think that's even further reinforced when those instructions say to you, oh, if it's a yellow leaf, maybe you're overwatering. I mean, if you are watering without even considering the soil dryness and without considering how much light your plant is getting, yeah, then overwatering could cause the leaf to yellow, right? But even if you're not, it can still happen. I have a picture of a Dracaena marginata, and that's the plant where it's like a trunk that goes up really tall, and there's like just kind of like a fluff of leaves at the top, right?
Yeah.
And I showed a picture of the number of leaves, yellowed leaves that I pulled off, and I said, every single one of these little lines on the stem is a scar of an older leaf that fell off. And so maybe the way that this plant grows is just, it's going to have a little bit of leaves at the top, and as it continues to get higher and higher, the older ones are just going to floff off, right?
Yeah. And so I had one of those in undergrad, and I only learned that the markings were the leaf droppings, when I read your book.
Right.
But I always knew, I never looked into it too in depth because there's always new growth at the top. So I always knew that something was okay because I could see the new growth.
Right.
So I didn't freak out. But like your education and the way you explain and break everything down, I think is extremely important and impactful. And you are an engineer by trade. So really you break it down into the why and how,
right,
more than just anything else.
Yeah, I think, so when I said earlier about the leaves falling off, I'm not saying that you just put your plant wherever and then let leaves fall off, right? The overall kind of philosophy is, at first you understand your interior conditions, like what conditions do you have to work with, right? And then number two is you try your best with the care. That's watering, that's knowing how much to fertilize, when to repot. All these things are all the efforts that you have to actively do, right? And then the last step is to let nature take its course. And when you incorporate all three of these into your mentality of how you take care of the plants, now you'll not beat yourself up if the plant loses a couple of leaves. Because you're going to ensure I'm putting this in the best place that I possibly can, and I'm watering it according to the right strategy. So nature is just taking its course, right?
So let's talk, you said something really important just there, putting the plant in its best spot or right spot. So this is a really big thesis almost for you, is the importance of light.
Right. Like I often say that it's not even enough to say that light is important. We have to understand that it is the prerequisite, like the foundation of how the plant lives, right? Because for the plant, the ability to photosynthesize is the same as us being able to go out to the grocery store and get our groceries and eat food so we can live, right? So what I came up with in the book, and which is now a hashtag, because as millennials we have to speak in hashtag, right? The hashtag is what my plant sees. So
I love it.
When you evaluate light, most people think just about the sun itself, right? And although all natural light originates from the sun, the sky and like light-colored buildings and even clouds and all these things, they transform how the light is received by your plant, right? And when you're outside, the sky is open to you, and maybe the sun is blocked by like a few by buildings or trees, right? But inside, we have the opposite situation where most of the sky is blocked, and you're now looking at light through this tiny little window.
Like my tiny one west-facing window that I have to jam all my plants into.
Right. And so when I'm saying consider what your plant sees, is because, actually, I'll backtrack one step. As the engineer, I took a light meter and I went and measured, and I said, well, here I'm standing here and I get 100-foot candles, but I move a little closer to the window and I get 400. But if somebody just says bright and direct light, that doesn't tell me that there's a difference between here and here. It just says, oh, the sun's not shining on you. So then I said, well, then what is shining on you? And it is the area of the sky that is visible to the plant, which then translates to, if you have bigger unobstructed windows, you're going to have more light. And it's not just that the sun is shining, it's because the sky is also in the view of the plant. So
if you have friends with big, huge windows,
it was a joke that I kept talking to my friends about anybody who you think has a green thumb probably just has really huge unobstructed
Big
windows. Yes.
So if we rewind this just a little bit back, light is measured in foot candles.
Right. That is one type of measurement of light.
What is a foot candle?
So we're taking the brightness of one candle.
Yep.
And seeing how bright it is on a area 1 square foot, 1 foot away from the candle.
Okay.
And you've probably also heard of something called lux, and that is the brightness of one candle on a surface area of 1 meter away from the candle.
Okay.
Now these are old types of measures, right? And in horticulture, they've used these for decades. Until now, we have more sophisticated instruments that can measure something called photon flux density, and that's they're doing a calculation that literally says how many photons are raining down on this spot per meter per second. Like that's the latest type of measurements that we use. But the great thing is foot candles, when we're dealing with natural light, is still a good enough approximation so that we don't make the mistake of saying that, oh, I can put the plant way back there because it's shade. No, if I take a light meter and I'm going to prove to you that way back there you're getting no higher than 20-foot candles, then I'm just going to say the plant's going to die slowly.
So which is very sad.
Yes.
In your book, it talks about mall plants that are under an escalator are just put there to slowly die.
Yes.
It's a very sad thought because they are living and breathing.
But it does speak to the mentality that, let's say the mall owner, they just want a piece of decor and they happen to like the idea that it's a living plant.
Yeah.
And so they just put it there. But the horticulturalist who I spoke to, who made that quote, he's speaking to the fact that he knows that people want this for decor and that he's just sending those plants to die.
So what about artificial lighting? If you love plants so much and you do not have a lot of natural light in your home, what is your take on artificial? So
grow lights are in fact really excellent at simulating that soft light that comes from just an open sky. So your grow light is not going to replace the sun itself. So it means that if you have a cactus, you could probably raise it under a grow light if you put the grow light like 6 inches away. Right. And this translates to when you measure that light, you're getting like 3,000 to 4,000 foot candles under the best kind of LED lights that we have, right? But when you have a grow light that's maybe, I don't know, a reasonable distance away, and it's like those 4 feet long T5 LED bulbs, if you measure it a foot away, you're going to get 600 to 700 foot candles. Now, what that translates into is, I don't know, let's say a north-facing window that's about, I don't know, 2 meters wide by 1 meter high, right? And you're sitting right under it. Like that's the kind of light intensity comparison that I can give you if you're talking about a grow light.
Right. So, and also it becomes an aesthetic thing. I have grow lights, which I use to raise my vegetable seedlings in February, March, April.
Right.
But I wouldn't go so far as to put all my succulents under there because I want to enjoy them out in my living room and such. Right. So
it's kind of we have to understand that houseplant care is really a compromise. It's a compromise between what looks good to us versus what will allow the plant to
thrive,
have the best life that it can possibly have, right? And I would say, unfortunately, most plant advice favors heavily on the decor side. So they'll make things that maybe don't work so well, like biologically, but they just say, well, it's pretty, so I want it that way, right? Or I want it on my coffee table because that's where it will make the coffee table look nicer. But we have to recognize that it's not the ideal place for it, but there are ways that we can do around it. Like the best example is in an office, right? You want the plant at your desk because you don't own the whole office, right? But I had a secretary one time, and she had this it was a type of fern. She kept it at her desk, and I measured the foot candles, and there was no windows nearby, and it was like 20 foot candles coming from the light above. And like I said to her, well, it's gonna have like 6 to 8 weeks to live, right? But then she said, but I really want it by my desk. And that got me to think, oh, maybe on the weekend you can, on the Friday, you can water it and then put it in the kitchen where our windows are so that it can sort of like recharge its batteries. And then you put it back on your desk. And when she did that, I would say that it lasted like a full year and a half. She actually left before, I still ended up taking care of it afterwards. But I'm just saying that, but when you do this sort of compromise, we have to recognize that all of it is a compromise.
Absolutely. So I have one west-facing window, and I jam all my plants into it, and I'm constantly rotating it because I'm attached to both sides, so I have neighbors very close on either my side. And so their house is very close, so it obstructs some of the view. So I am constantly just switching things around to give them a little bit better light. Keeping the ones that need the most in the higher light places.
Right.
But I have always thought about the best life for my plant. But I've noticed with houseplant owners, if they don't understand the plant quite to the depth that they should at the very beginning of purchasing it, they go to a plant store and they just pick out something that they like the look of, not knowing the requirements that specific plant needs. So I always would advise somebody to do as much research as you can as possible before and in your surroundings and in your space before you bring something in that will slowly die.
Yeah, but even with that thought, like some plants, I was recently asked about an alocasia, right? And I just said, alocasias are bulb plants and means that their leaves grow in one season and then it stays alive for a couple of months and then they drop off and die. And if you know that that's going to happen, then you won't panic when the whole thing dies, right?
Yes.
So it's all about having a more in-depth understanding of how the plant grows so that it's like you manage your expectations on it, right? Whereas I know a pothos, it just keeps growing, right? It never dies back in the way that, let's say, oxalis or alocasia dies back at some point, right?
Right.
So if you have a bit deeper understanding of how each plant grows, then when you inevitably see some form of decay, you're not going to panic because you know it's supposed to happen that way.
I won't panic. I've killed many plants. I have. Over the years, I've lived in a lot of different places. I've traveled, I've brought them to a lot of different places. And that is a really hard thing in itself, is moving locations and then
total
finding
shift in the environment.
Exactly. Finding the right place to put them now. I find also I kill sometimes after I repot.
It's like, well, I cover it in the book as well. When we repot a plant, back up for when the decision to repot the plant is upon us, it's not just, oh, I think it looks tight. It actually needs to be that the roots of the plant have grown to such an extent that they coil up around the base of the pot. And that's something called root bound. To the point where sometimes you can even see the root peeking out the drainage hole. That's kind of the sign that you should probably unpot it gently and take a look.
Yes.
And if it's like a matted mass of roots all to the bottom, then that's the clear sign to repot. But when we repot, we don't just want to plop it in, just take it out and plop it into the next size up and then put some soil on it. You actually need to loosen off a bit of the old soil. Uncoil. I mean, you do it gently, you're going to break a few roots here and there, but it's not like the end of its life, right? You have to gently break it apart and loosen out some of that old soil so that when you put it into the new pot, those roots will be ready to sort of find the new soil, right?
Yeah. And do you only repot up an inch or two?
Yeah, I would only go up so that it's maybe 1 or 2 inches in diameter bigger from the old pot. Because the thing is, if you have, let's say you took a single cutting and you plopped it into an 8-inch pot. So you're like this, right?
It's swimming in there.
The root system is only going to be, let's say, 4 inches around it. But the rest of the soil is just going to stay moist. Let's say then you water, right? Then the rest of that soil is just going to stay moist and nothing is going to be taking up that soil. And whenever you have a high moisture environment with low oxygen and low, it's kind of stale, that's the perfect breeding grounds for the root rot bacteria.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a great segue into a bit of watering. So I do quite responsive watering. I bring most of my plants, if they're even some of the big ones, right into my kitchen sink.
Right.
And I water and I drain right through and I wait and then I water again if there's any air pockets in there, which is why I always plant with a pot with a drainage hole.
Right.
Because I always say like, I'm a bit of a lazy gardener,
Yeah.
but really I'm not. But if I don't want to leave any guesswork, so I just water all the way through, drains out, and then I'm done. So talk to me a little bit about what you've learned over the years with your watering practice.
So when you first read a lot of plant care advice, you're kind of taking the approach, I'm going to get some instructions here, right? And that's why maybe horticulturalists have had to, I would say, settle on just saying, okay, water it once a week, right? And again, like I said before, it'll work in some cases, it'll not work in others, right? Now, the reason why I say light is the prerequisite is because that will only work depending on the amount of light the plant receives. And if it's not receiving any light any light at all, then the watering becomes very erratic and your soil is actually kind of stale, right?
Right.
So assuming we have the right light, then I like to think of watering not as like by a schedule, but more like a strategy. Like I actually like what you said about responsive watering, meaning that it requires you to observe and make a decision, right? And when it comes to, I can blanket statement, all plants will fall under 3 categories. The first is you keep the soil evenly moist. That's like a maidenhair fern. Means that the moment that I lift the pot, if it's even slightly lighter than when it's completely drenched, then I take it back to the sink and I drench it again, assuming, again, drainage holes, right? Then the next type of strategy is water when it's partially dry. And for this one, you can kind of just look at the top of the soil. If it's mostly dry, I would maybe take a chopstick and probe it a little bit to see how dry it is a little deeper. And again, lifting the pot also tells you how much water has been absorbed into the plant / evaporated.
By the weight.
By the weight of the overall weight. And then take it to the sink, get it back to the fully moistened part, right? Then the last strategy is wait till the soil is absolutely completely dry. This obviously applies to your cacti and succulents, right?
Yeah.
And so for again, this one, you're just looking at the soil itself, and you can easily see what totally dry soil looks like, right? So you just pick it up, it's totally dry, then you take it to water and bring it back to that fully wet state.
Right.
Now, the time frame between each time you water
depends on the light.
Depends on the light, right?
Yes.
So for an evenly moist plant, I have my maidenhair fern sitting up against the window. It actually gets 2 to 3 hours of direct sun. So I have to check it every single day, because if it goes through even one day of being partially dry and the sun hits it, that's when all the leaves just turn crispy.
Right.
Right. So that's why for those plants, I'm checking it every single day. But then my bigger dracaenas in the same window, I'm checking the soil. It's going to be a little longer, right?
So taking your engineer brain, I'm very curious. Have you ever taken a saturated pot, same pot, and weighed it versus when it is dry? So
I do have the idea that one day I want to do a time lapse of this, right? But I have done that exact thing. But the purpose of doing this was not just to understand the weight, but to then understand the volume. Because, okay, so this actually has to do with how do you water a pot with no drainage holes?
Right.
Right. So what I did was I took a cup of pure soil and I punched some drainage holes in it. I weighed it when it was completely dry. Let's say it's 100 grams. Then I watered it to the way of being like totally soaked and letting it all extra drip off. And then I weighed it again. And now let's say it's, I don't know, it's probably, it's 120, let's say, right? Now, what I did was, instead of just understanding that, okay, therefore 20 grams of water is in here, I then took an empty cup and poured out onto a scale 20 grams of water. And the purpose of doing this is so that I could visually understand like the volume ratio between the total amount of water of what 20 grams of water looks like compared to this gram of soil.
So interesting.
So the reason I did this is because now I have like a pot that has no drainage holes. if instead of trying to weigh it on a scale, I would just estimate the volume to be, let's say, like a quarter of the total volume of soil. And then, because when you pour stuff into a cup, like our daily interactions with liquids is that I could probably close my eyes and pour a quarter of a cup of water, right? But when it comes to weighing, you can't really do that as easily. So when I pour in the water to water one of my plants that has no drainage holes, I just think, okay, it's got to be no more than a quarter of this total volume of soil.
Really taking the guesswork out of it all.
But of course, this still has to be under the assumption that the plant is going to have the right light.
Absolutely.
Because even if I follow this, but I'm putting the plant in a dark corner, it's not going to work, right? Like
right.
The soil is just going to stay moist for a long time, and then it'll
We have aloes in our workspace, and they get so much light. They sit in a southwest window,
right.
Really bright light. And I've never had to water aloe as frequently as I have. And
right.
That is a direct reflection of where they are.
For sure. But the size of those plants is probably much bigger than if you were to put it, farther away. You put it farther away, yes, you water less frequently, but its growth will be much slower, right? All of these things are in balance with the factors, because these are living things that convert the things in their environment into their own bodies, right?
So this is a good example of if you are somebody who takes your house plants out in the summer and they have kind of exponential growth,
right.
Then you bring them back into the winter, they become somewhat dormant. That's a great example of it, because they're getting all of this sun. And I have another question about that. Do you ever have a fan on in your room to give the...
No, I've never had a fan on, and I actually don't even have a humidifier, which a lot of people think that, humidity is so important. Like it is important, but at the same time, it is really plant dependent, right?
Right.
Like I just mostly have plants that don't really care too much about humidity. And another important thing to have is actually have a hygrometer to measure like the humidity. Like don't just think, I need higher humidity, But if you measured it, like yesterday we had a thunderstorm, it was 70% humidity inside my place, right?
Right.
And in the summer in Toronto, it's typically between 50 to 60% humidity. And your inside and outside environments are pretty connected. Like you don't live in a sealed box, right?
No. Okay, so one of my favorite time-lapse videos of yours is the when you aerate the soil of the Fittonia. Can you tell me a little bit about how long this took, what the setup was like?
So the thing with the Fittonia is it's one of these very dramatically wilting plants, meaning that the moment the soil reaches that completely dry point, then the plant just flops over, right?
Yeah.
Now, I know it looks dead to a lot of people, but what it really is that you've just let the soil get to the too dry point, right? So I think later we'll talk about the strategy of watering, and the Fittonia is one of those plants you have to keep it evenly moist. So the moment it gets too dry, the plant just dramatically wilts. Peace lily is like that.
Polka dot plant?
Polka dot plant is like that too.
Yeah, I've been noticing ours.
So anyway, what I did with this time lapse was I happened to leave this guy a little too long, and I saw it totally drooped over. And I know that the time lapse videos are something that really give people a sense of just how alive plants are and how they respond, right? So this video is just kind of showing that. But one thing that I added on top of that was when you aerate the soil, this is where you're taking a chopstick and you're gently loosening the soil around the stems. Like you're not jabbing it hard, right? Because you don't want to hurt the roots too much, right? But you poke around it so that way when you water it, the water can more evenly flow through and penetrate all the areas of the soil. And out in the wild, this is why we love earthworms. This is why insects are so important to our plants, right? But indoors, we don't have any of that. So your plants indoors are actually kind of like their soil is bored. They need the shifting of soil structure, right? So that's what I try to illustrate with this video. And in terms of the time, like you could see, I put a clock or my watch in front of it. And so it took about 8 hours for it to fully respond.
Wow. And so how often do you do time-lapse videos?
Now I've invested in having like several cameras that can all do the time lapses. So, I mean, this type of time lapse where it's a wilted plant to a fully perky one. I don't do it too often only because obviously it's not great to have your plant wilted dramatically like this, right? And as opposed to what a lot of people think, no, I don't purposely wait till this happens and do the time lapse. I do it when I see it, I see the opportunity. But one more interesting one is the daily plant movement. So like oxalis, calathea, prayer plants, these guys, they actually move throughout the day, right?
Yeah.
And so capturing it by time lapse is something just super interesting and really shows, yes, your plant is alive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the last type, which is my favorite, although it takes the most time, is like a leaf growing. Yes. And this can take anywhere from like a week to a couple months, right? And yeah, this is where I'm just having the camera look at the plant for a long, long time. And when you put it all together in like an animation, then it's just something so it's so mind-boggling that this is all happening right in front of our eyes, but we just cannot perceive how this changes, right?
Yeah, and you can't capture it just even if you were to look at it every day. The time-lapse captures the whole story. And it's so visually entertaining. It is so beautiful to see.
Yeah, and I think in the past we've always had like flower blooming time lapses, right? But now I think it's kind of interesting that digital photography is so accessible to all people that now we can film whatever we want and find the things that interest us in terms of plants and other things.
So thank you so much for coming on Gardenstead.
Thank you for having me.
And it's just been so lovely to really break down your mentality and how creative really you are with plants. Thank you for coming.